first of all, could I just get you to clarify what your role was for Doors Open Days in the time that you were here?
Well, I was the technical director of the Scottish Civic Trust, and that meant that I had, responsibility to oversee everything that had to do with our connection with buildings and the built environment generally, leaving the other staff to get on with administering the trust, which wasn't my forte at all. And it was a very good arrangement, that, because I had more or less free range under the trustees to get on with what I thought I knew about, and other people dealt with everything else.
Right. So when did the Scottish Civic Trust actually begin?
It began back in 1967.
What were the reasons for starting the trust?
Well, the reason was that the Civic Trust main body had already begun down in London in 1956. They had done one or two operations up in Scotland, but with our completely different planning system, our different education system, our different legal system, all the rest of it, I think they realised after a bit that this wasn't the best way of handling things, particularly 400 odd miles and more away. So they, I think, took the initiative, having already one or two Scotsmen as trustees of the Civic Trust, including Sir Robert Matthew, and they decided they needed a separate body up here. And very, very wisely, they made it completely independent financially and self-sustaining, and came up, in the early days at least, with help for some of the bigger projects, but otherwise just let things happen here, independently of London. Mm-hmm. And so that's the way really it was set up to begin with.
Right. And during the 60s, was there anything in particular happening with architecture in Scotland that made it an important
Well,
time?
yes, there were one or two things. The National Trust was getting going with things like its Little Houses scheme already, so it was showing the way in terms of some aspects of conservation. The early days of regeneration, which were actually a bit cosmetic, were happening in that the Civic Trust had already managed what they call street improvement schemes in England, and they had actually also overseen a couple in Scotland with Scottish architects looking after them, one I think in Montrose, one in Haddington, and so actually that carried on, and I coordinated one down in Biggar in Lanarkshire, which was a lovely thing to do. It took 2 or 3 years to get the traders and the other residents of the high street on side, and to get the then little borough authority, but that came as an initiative from the chap who was the then provost of Biggar in the old days when small boroughs had their own self-government. So that was one thing that carried over. But the big thing that I was completely unaware of, and I think we were all unaware of when I first joined, which was in 1968, was the way that listed buildings would overtake a huge amount of what we were about to be doing, because up to that time there had been very few formally listed buildings in Scotland, and none of the kind of listed building control systems that came in with the Planning Act just then, the new Scottish Planning Act. And we found ourselves landed, as far as I know, with very little, if no warning, that we would be one of the bodies who would be expected to look into some of the more damaging of the applications to demolish or severely alter listed buildings. And I was the only person on the spot who had any possible responsibility for that in the trust. So I had to sort of pick up on all that and start rushing around the country looking at wrecks of buildings.
So now, of course, buildings at risk are sort of projects within the Scottish Civic Trust. Do you remember when they were set up?
You'd have to look back to the records to be absolutely sure, but my guess is that it was late 80s or early 90s. Mm-hmm. And Mary Myers, who's now a very big architectural journalist down in London, ran it for several years until as it gradually developed. But that came out of a very small operation that the sort of historic buildings branch of the Scottish government was up to, and it was just advertising really within government's own circles the fact that some buildings, might become available. Was anybody interested? Mm-hmm. and one or two people I knew quite well in the what's now historic Scotland decided that this was the wrong way to go about it, and it needed to be spread around much more. Mm-hmm. So we got the commission from the government actually to do that, and it was all paid for centrally. We didn't have to find the funding.
Moving on to how Doors Open Days started now, I've read on the website that you were inspired by a Heritage Day celebration in the Netherlands
yes.
in 1989.
Yes.
Could you tell me?
No, actually I got that wrong maybe. It was 88 when I looked at it again, yes. Right. And it was one of these things that just as one of these coincidental things, I think, the way things begin without you expecting them to. Because my wife is an academic, and when she was doing her PhD in Edinburgh, she had a colleague and friend who eventually went on to work at a university in the Netherlands, and a year came up where they were inviting people from other countries to come and give lectures. So he invited my wife to go over to Groningen in the Netherlands to give this lecture and spend the weekend there. And lo and behold, on the Saturday, all these extraordinary things were happening in Groningen that I had no idea of. And it turned out to be the Dutch year, or maybe the second year, that they had been doing their equivalent of Doors Open Day in the Netherlands. And they'd picked it up from France. And the Council of Europe was beginning to get interested in the whole idea at that time. And they took on the coordination throughout Europe then, or just a little bit later. But anyway, in Groningen there were things like old almshouses, which people couldn't normally visit because they were lived in by elderly people, but they were open. University premises were open. The courthouse was open. And one of the big churches, big medieval churches, was a brass band blaring away. It was absolutely tremendous, you know. And so we thought this was really quite interesting. But then it dawned on us that the following year, actually, Glasgow was going to be the European City of Culture, which it hadn't expected to be, but that's the way it was. And so that was really the stimulus for getting it started here. I think without that, it would have been rather difficult to sort of parade the country and tell people what a good idea this was, without a way of kicking it off to let people see what could happen. So again, just Scotland being a fairly small world, I happen to know the person who was appointed to be the arts coordinator for City of Culture, including built environment stuff, and she discussed this with her colleagues and said, yes, okay, we'll fund it and give it a go. And she took on Liz Davidson, who had been already working with us here on the technical side. And Liz really organised the Glasgow Day. And then our good friends down in Ayr, the Kyle and Carrick Civic Society, who've always been very active, decided, well, if Glasgow's going to do it, we'll try as well. So that's the way that began. And Liz would tell you, I'm sure, how she organised the Glasgow Day. But it was a huge success. It was part of a bigger cultural programme, of course. It was just slotted in. But I think it proved to be so enjoyable, and so many people decided to give it a go that day that we thought, well, this is it. We'll see how we can make this work throughout the country.
So
and England and Wales and Northern Ireland hadn't really boned up on it to that extent. So they came in later on. I think also encouraged by the Council of Europe, probably, not just because we'd started it in Scotland. Another corollary which came out of our Doors Open Day, which I'm still very pleased about, is this idea that within the month of September, different areas can choose their own dates, which as far as I know is still unique. And one of the reasons we did this is that Scottish public holidays tend to be based on where you live, so that Edinburgh's are different in September anyway from Glasgow's. And it also seemed to me a very good idea because it meant that if people who were so involved in opening their own buildings in one place, if they wanted to get involved, could actually go and visit somewhere else and get the same experience as a visitor. And I think that does happen, and people do travel around quite a lot.
How about your favourite Doors Open Day events so far?
Well, I just have to think about that, because obviously there must have been a whole lot. That something that really I wasn't aware of in Glasgow was the what was then the Italian Cultural Centre up at Park Circus, which is now the Civil Marriage Centre, which is such an elaborate, fancy building designed to be occupied by one of the big iron founders, and it's where he showed off all his best kind of interior decoration and ironmongery and so on to his clients. And that is absolutely tremendous, and I think that was probably one of the biggest shocks in Glasgow and biggest sort of pleasurable surprises to be able to get in there, because again, when it was just occupied as a kind of Italian club or something like that, you know, it was a place that normally people who weren't from that kind of background would have known much about. One story I heard, which is wonderful, is that down at the Clyde Port Authority building, which I think has been a regular on Doors Open Day ever since, it has marvellous Edwardian interiors. The previous day, must have been the Friday evening, one of the senior staff was leaving and he saw the janitor and he said, "Oh, you are remembering to be here tomorrow because some people may drop in to have a look round the building. You better put a kettle on just in case." Well, I gather that something like 1,500 people turned up in the day.
That's a lot of cups of tea.
That's right.